What's up, guys? Neil Orfield here, and I'm going to make a quick video showing you how I set up my fantasy cruncher for the Chiefs-Bengals single game slate on FanDuel. I say how I did set it up. This is a little bit different than usual because I have already gone through and set up my fantasy cruncher. I already made this video once, but due to some technical difficulties, I have to remake it. So rather than erasing everything that I've already done, going to save some time. I'm just going to show you what I have already done in setting up my fantasy cruncher. While you're coming in, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that notification button so you can get alerts when our shows go live. All right, so the first thing I did is I rearranged my columns. As you can see here, I moved things around so that I have ownership projection, my projection, how much I get of players after I've run a crunch, and exposure caps in the middle of my screen. That's what I want to see in the middle of my screen. The second thing I did is I sorted by projection. And of course, I did this before I altered any of the projections, but I just scrolled down and removed anybody who had a projection of 0 from my player pool to save some time in making my groups. Those players will no longer show up when you make your groups if you remove them from your player pool. So I just unchecked those boxes for players with a projection of 0. Third thing I did is I went to this MVP tab and I set an exposure cap here of 20%. You click this button, edit here, and then you can add an exposure cap here universally for all players. Of course, you can always alter individual player exposure caps too, but I just used a universal exposure cap of 20%, set that in the MVP field. After that, I went into the advanced options, and I just work in 2 tabs here in the advanced options, the general tab and the groups tab. Starting in the general tab, I leave unique players per lineup at 1 player. If you're making 40 or fewer lineups, I do recommend using 2 just for the sake of diversifying your lineup set. Salary cap, I set at $58,500. So I'm leaving $1,500 on the table here. That is just for the sake of avoiding the most duplicated lineups. And this isn't a magical number either, I should say. I use this for the sake of the video. I'm just trying to demonstrate that I do like to leave some salary on the table. I think that $1,500 is a pretty good starting place. You could leave a little bit more if you want to really avoid dupes. You could leave a little bit less if you're not as concerned with duplicating. But I think this is a good starting place just to avoid the most duplicated lineups. Offensive players versus defense, the default is set to 2. I changed that to 4 so I can potentially have 4 players from one team against the defense of the opposing team. It has actually won this season. We saw that happen in a Browns game, maybe Browns Bengals. I don't remember who the teams were exactly, but we have seen it work. It's not going to happen all that often. I'm not going to get a ton of those lineups anyway, but if they project well enough to get into my lineup set, I want to allow for the possibility. Exposure cap globally, leaving at 100%. As you saw, I already changed it to 20% in the MVP spot specifically. And then randomness, I use 30%. If you want more control over your lineups, use a lower number here, or turn off randomness completely if you want complete control over your lineups. Minimum projection included in calculation, the default was set to 3. I changed it to 2. Sometimes it's a little bit easier. You can have a little bit more control if you do set this a little bit lower, just because sometimes if you want a player in your player pool, but you give them a projection of 3, you're going to end up with like 50% of them. It's just a little bit easier if you can set that projection lower. So that's what I did in this case. And then if there is a player who I want in my player pool who projects for fewer than 2 fantasy points, I'll just go ahead and boost their projection manually to make sure that they are above 2 fantasy points. And finally, players from each team max, the default is set to 4. I leave that at 4. So I can have 4 players from one team against the defense of the opposing team. So that's all I do in the general tab. Then in the groups tab, you can see I set up for the NFC game also, but for this AFC game, I made 4 groups. The first being a Mahomes MVP group. So all I did was I found Patrick Mahomes in the MVP spot down here, and I clicked this key button to make him my key player. So once you make a player your key player, essentially that group is all about that player in that spot. So in this case, it's Patrick Mahomes in the MVP spot. You can also add multiple players into a group. If you make multiple players your key player, and then the group will revolve around those multiple players. But in this case, I'm just using 1. I made Patrick Mahomes my MVP as the key player, and then I added all of his pass catching options in the flex to a secondary group. So to add players to your secondary group, you use these buttons. So you're not making them key players, you're just adding them to the secondary group. And then the rule that I used here for Patrick Mahomes, if any key players used, then use at least 1 player from this group, all the players that I added to the secondary group. And the reason I did that is Patrick Mahomes has shown some rushing upside this season. It's unclear how much rushing upside he's going to have on this high ankle sprain. It might really limit his mobility. But unclear to me exactly what his rushing upside is. If you think that he's not going to be able to run at all, I might just change this to at least 2 players. What I did is I used 1 player, but then I also gave boost to his pass catchers to make it more likely that I get to multiple Chiefs in those Patrick Mahomes MVP lineups. Initially, I started with 12% for all wide receivers, 12% boost for all wide receivers and tight ends, 4% for Pacheco and Ronald Jones, and 6% for Jerick McKinnon. I adjusted from there because I was running into so many lineups that were just Patrick Mahomes at MVP with 1 pass catcher. That was like the majority of my lineups. And some of them were Patrick Mahomes with just Isaiah Pacheco, which I don't really love because Pacheco's not a great pass catcher. So I adjusted these numbers a little bit to make it more likely that I get to multiple receivers or tight ends or Jerick McKinnon rather than Isaiah Pacheco. So just adjusted as I went. It's all trial and error for me in making these lineups. So that is a decision that I made after I ran a crunch or 2. But in general, I'm allowing for Patrick Mahomes with just one of these players. I prefer to have multiple. Second group I made, same thing with Joe Burrow. Made Joe Burrow my in the MVP spot my key player. Added all of his pass catchers in the flex to the secondary group, and this is more like how I originally set up the Chiefs before I was running into all those issues with Mahomes single stack. So just added 12% boost to all of his wide receivers and tight ends, a 6% boost for Samaje Perine because he's pretty involved in the passing game, and then a smaller boost for Joe Mixon in there as well. So that's all I do for the Joe Burrow MVP group. I'm only requiring 1 player from this group down here, but then I am also giving boosts to make it more likely that I get to multiple in those Burrow MVP lineups. And then Mahomes in the flex, I added all of his pass catchers in the flex spot and then also the MVP spot. I did include, okay, I wasn't sure if I included Isaiah Pacheco in here. I thought about leaving Pacheco out. Oh, right, because this is FanDuel, I decided to include Pacheco. I'm a little bit looser with the rules on FanDuel because it's a little bit more viable for a quarterback to be optimal in the flex without any pass catchers on FanDuel, just because it's not PPR. If they spread the ball around, sometimes the quarterback can score a lot of points without really bringing along any pass catcher with them, especially with like Travis Kelce at 1,400. He could put up 15 fantasy points, score a couple touchdowns that Mahomes also gets credit for. But then if that's all that Kelce does, he doesn't score any other fantasy points. Maybe he's not optimal. And then Mahomes maybe throws, 1 more touchdown or, there are ways for it to work out. So I'm a little bit looser with the rules on FanDuel. So I did include Isaiah Pacheco, Ronald Jones in this secondary group. And all I did with this group, I'm just saying, if I have Patrick Mahomes in the flex, made him my key player, then I want at least 1 player from this group also in the lineup. And I didn't give any boost or anything. I just said, that's what I want. Just at least 1 from this group if I have Mahomes in the flex. Made the same group for Burrow. And again, because I've got the quarterbacks now in the flex spot, I also add all of the pass catchers in the MVP spot and the flex spot. So they can be you just want 1 pass catcher from that group somewhere else in your lineup. So that's all I did with those groups. Go back and save, which again, I'm not sure it actually necessary. I do it every time anyway. You know what I did immediately the first time I won 6 figures in a DFS contest? I converted my trial membership to Stokastic, which was awesome at the time, to a full annual subscription. That's because I knew these were the best tools in the industry. That was 2019, and they've gotten even better since then. Well, good news. You can get access to these same tools without winning 6 figures first with a great offer from BetMGM. You can get 2 months of Stokastic Plus Platinum when you sign up, deposit, and bet at least $10. That's every tool on the site for every sport other than Fantasy Cruncher, a $240 value. All you need to do is click the link in the description of this video, follow the steps, and deposit $10 or more, and place a bet of $10 or more on whatever you want. And when that bet settles, MGM will hit you up with how to get your subscription to Stokastic. You don't even need to win the bet. On top of all of that, you also get bet insurance on your first bet up to $1,000. That means if you win the bet, you get your money. If you lose the bet, you still get your money back in site credits. It's a great deal from BetMGM and a long trial subscription to the best DFS tools out there. The legal age for gambling in most states is 21 plus, and if you or someone you know has a gambling problem, call or text 1-800-GAMBLER. Reminder, make sure you use the link or use promo code PLATINUMSUB or we won't be able to track you. And then I just crunch it out. So then, the final part of my process after doing all that is I crunch out 150 lineups using my projections, which originally are the Stokastic projections, crunch it out. And then the final part of my process is looking at the lineups themselves, making sure they correlate the way I want them to, And as you can see, so I made adjustments. I gave bigger boosts to some of these pass catchers to make it more likely that I get to multiple in my Mahomes MVP lineups. And you see right away, worked out, got a couple more in there. So I adjusted. Okay, here we can see, here's Mahomes with just Pacheco in the MVP spot. I don't totally love that just because Pacheco's not a great pass catching option, but I think that's fine. Mahomes in the flex, Pacheco at MVP seems fine. And when I've got Mahomes in the flex spot, I don't mind at all having just one player in the also in the lineup. It's only when he's in the MVP spot that I really feel I'd prefer to have multiple. So again, here we've got Mahomes with Juju and Kadarius Toney. So it seems that my adjustments to the group have worked out a little bit. So I'm getting, more often I'm getting Mahomes at MVP with multiple pass catchers, which is my preference. Again, I intentionally allowed for some lineups to have Mahomes at MVP with just one pass catcher. I just don't want that to be the majority. So anyway, these lineups look like they are correlating well enough. When I've got Burrow at MVP, I'm getting multiple Bengals. When I've got Mahomes at MVP, I'm getting multiple Chiefs. I think that is my preference in general. I want the majority of my lineups to look that way if I have a quarterback in the MVP spot. And then if I don't have a quarterback in the MVP spot, I just want to make sure that when I've got the quarterback in the lineup somewhere, that they are paired with a pass catcher somewhere else in the lineup. And you can see that worked out here as well. Again, this a little bit thinner when it's just Mahomes with Pacheco, just because he's not a great pass catcher. But again, I intentionally allowed for that. So I think the lineups are looking pretty good. And then the other thing that I did is I just went position by position, going through, checking how much I'm getting of different players. And I made slight adjustments, just incremental adjustments to their projections to get closer to exposure levels that I like for each player. So I've already made some of these adjustments. And you can see here, initially I was getting like 0 Joe Mixon, and I didn't want 0 Joe Mixon. So I gave him a boost. I'm up to getting to 22% Joe Mixon now, 16% McKinnon. Looks like I'm getting honestly close to where I'd like to be with these numbers. Again, we don't have ownership projections here yet, so I'm not sure like how owned Samaje Perine is going to be. If he's going to be 5% owned, I will want to be well above the field. If he's going to be 25% owned, I'll probably be below the field on Samaje Perine. It's all going to depend on what the ownership projection is. But you can see I've just made incremental adjustments, and I just make, 0.2, 0.4. Occasionally there will be a player that I'm getting 0 of, and I know that I'm going to want at least like 20%. Then maybe I'll give them a full fantasy point boost to their projection. But in general, I'm moving incrementally to get more or less of players. And then I just recrunch, and I do it over and over. And sometimes I'll crunch 25, 30 times. I'm not going to do that in a video, but you can see I've already, after making incremental adjustments, I am getting closer to the level that I do like Tyler Boyd quite a bit. 55% still probably a little bit higher than I'd like for Tyler Boyd. But in general, I'm getting, after making incremental adjustments, going position by position, getting closer to where I think I want to be with my player exposures. So anyway, not going to continue doing so, but as you can see, I just make small adjustments. You could also just use the thumbs up or thumbs down feature to get more or less of players. That will give you an 8% boost to the player's projection. It's the default, at least. You can change the percent in the advanced options, but in general, the default is going to be an 8% boost if you give 1 thumbs up, and you can give up to 3 thumbs up for a player. I don't bother with that. Instead, I just give projection boosts. But anyway, that is my general process for using Fantasy Cruncher to create lineups on FanDuel. Hope you can find some success using this or a similar process. Good luck.